Hello? Hi, I'm showing 5 o'clock, so let's get started. Been asked to ask you all to turn off your cell phones to make sure it's no interference, I guess. So, hello. I'm Kyle Orland. I'm Senior Gaming Editor at Ars Technica, and this is Analyzing the Steam Marketplace using publicly derived sales estimates. Now, I've been covering the game business for a little over a decade, and anyone covering this industry or following it, one major annoyance is the lack of reliable, specific data about sales of games. Now, it's not like this in most other entertainment media. It's just not a problem. Nielsen, for instance, provides ratings literally overnight for TV shows and makes the headline numbers very public in publications like Variety. Theaters and studios provide box office estimates every weekend for movies. You can get detailed lists on sites like Box Office Mojo. There's Billboard charts for music. There's the New York Times bestseller list every week for books, et cetera, et cetera. Then there are massive websites dedicated to chronicling and analyzing all of these numbers back into history. So what do we have for games? For games, we have this. This is what NPD, a US tracking firm, sends to the media every month. It's a top 10 list based on their sampling of US retail outlets and now electronic sales. If you pay a lot of money, you can get more details than this. You can get every game that they track and actual sales numbers. But people who get those numbers are contractually prevented from sharing them publicly, and NPD is pretty strict about enforcing it. You get occasional leaks sometimes, but nothing really comprehensive, which is how it should be. NPD is a for-profit company. They're not doing this for their health. But we don't have anything like the numbers that other media have. This gives you some idea of what's popular, this listing of the top 10, but it's really only a vague notion of what the market looks like. For one, there's no actual numbers here, just a ranking. We don't know if Call of Duty in this month had 2 times as many or 10 times as many sales as Grand Theft Auto 5. It could be either way. NPD used to share actual sales numbers for these top 10 every month, but it hasn't done that for years. It also smashes all the platforms together. So what you're seeing here for Call of Duty Advanced Warfare is a combination of the Xbox 360, the Xbox One, PlayStation 4, PlayStation 3, and PC versions. You don't know how each of those versions are doing individually. Again, this is a change from what NPD used to do. You also have no idea how things are doing outside of the top 10. A game could be the 12th most popular game all year, and you would never see it on the NPD list. You just have no idea how it was selling. Now, to get more details, in the game business, we usually have to rely on self-reporting from publishers. Every so often, if you follow the game press, you'll see this kind of story. It comes from a press release or a tweet. Someone at the publisher says Game X sold Y million copies. Here, Grand Theft Auto 5 shipped 45 million copies, which, by the way, is a little bit insane. 45 million copies for Grand Theft Auto 5. Let's just let that sink in for a moment. Good, okay. So the only thing about this is you only hear about it when it's good news. You don't hear about the AAA game that flops. No one is putting out a press release saying this big game sold 20,000 copies in its first month. That's just embarrassing. Even for successful games, some publishers might not want to share their numbers for any number of reasons. Maybe they don't want the competition to know exactly how well they're doing. Maybe they don't want people to cotton on to exactly what the sales are. Maybe it's just a collective action problem. I would share if everyone else was sharing, but I'm not just going to give away my numbers. And when they do share, these publishers, it doesn't stay updated at any regular interval. So this is a story from February 3rd, 2015. In the last month or so, Grand Theft Auto 5 might have sold 1 million more copies, might have sold 5 million more copies. I believe it sold 45 million more copies. It's Grand Theft Auto 5. We just don't know until Take-Two decides to tell us, which is really not an ideal state of affairs. For the vast majority of games, though, even if they're AAA games that are successful, the publisher will never even release this kind of statement. We'll just have no idea directly from the publisher what sales are. So we have to go outside of the publishers. Now, there are sites like VG Charts. They do their own estimates, but there are some well-documented problems with the way they generate them, and I'm going to leave it there rather than dwell on it, but I don't consider that a really reliable source either. Now, Steam, to its credit, gives some pretty good data for how popular games are doing. The list you see here is updated consistently on the Steam website. It shows how many current players are playing the top games and the peak for concurrent players that day. So as you can see, Dota 2 on this day had about 882,000 players when I took this screenshot and had reached 1.1 million concurrent players that day, which is pretty high. Now, this is useful for seeing what's popular right now, which is pretty important. And there are sites that watch this list and archive its history, so you can go back a month or a year and see what people were playing that day. Very useful. But there are some problems here, of course. This doesn't measure sales. This just measures concurrent players. So if Dota 2 has 1.1 million players that day, I don't know how many people have Dota 2 that weren't playing that day, or who even weren't playing at that very moment. I can't be guaranteed that all Dota 2 players were playing at any point in that day. Maybe they were spread out throughout the day. Maybe if a game is popular only in the East Coast of the United States, it has a lot of concurrent players during prime time for that location. But a game with worldwide appeal would have it spread out all over the timing. And this only shows the top 100 Steam games. That's a pretty healthy number, but if a game is, the 150th most popular, it's never going to show up here. And with 4,400 Steam games currently, the vast majority of games, we're not going to get any data from this. So for years, I've been looking for the holy grail of public sales data, but like someone trying to slice bread with a doorstop, I kept saying to myself, there's got to be a better way. And I think I found it, at least for Steam. It all started, I was looking around Steam one day, and I noticed a tab on my public profile that says all games. And this lists, obviously, all the games that I own, and even tracks how many hours I've put into each one. This is true for anyone with a public Steam profile. I look around my friends list, and I saw that I could figure out every game that they had ever bought too. Steam just puts this data out there. So this got me thinking. If we could scrape this data down from Steam servers somehow for every user on Steam, we would know every game that had been purchased by every Steam user and know the sales for all of those games. This is the holy grail we've been searching for. It was sitting right there under our noses all this time. Now, one problem here. There are about 125 million active Steam accounts, according to Valve. Now, that's maybe not a big deal if you're Google and you have a whole warehouse of servers you can just throw at the problem. But if you're me, if you're a lone journalist with some basic PHP and SQL skills and a small budget for an Amazon instance, you're not going to sample anything like 125 million active Steam accounts in anything like the time you need. By the time I got to the 125 millionth Steam account, if I went in order, I would have probably 2-year-old data from the first Steam account, which would not be very useful. The solution to this problem, if you know any statistics, is random sampling. I won't go into the deep statistical basis for this, but it's the same general idea as nationwide polling, where you can poll about 3,000 people at random from around the country and tell what the result of a presidential election is going to be with 100 million voters. So the idea here would be to poll random Steam pages, see what they own, and then extrapolate out for an estimate of what the entire Steam universe looks like. Simple enough. Now, how do we get a random sample of pages? Luckily, Steam has a unique identifier built in for each user. It's called your Steam ID. Now, this isn't the name that you set for yourself. This is mine, Kyle ORL. It's not that. It's a number here, the 17-digit number you see there. It's a bit hidden, but you can find it with sites like SteamIDfinder.com here, or even going through Steam console commands. And everyone has one, a unique one. The Steam ID numbers might look random, but actually they all fall into a certain range of 17-digit numbers shown here. I have no idea how Valve generated those numbers, but that is the range. It's detailed on the Steam developer wiki that generally higher IDs join Steam later, but that's not always true. There's some gaps where people have deleted their accounts and new people have filled in. And the range is growing all the time as new users come into Steam. So you have to go in and periodically spot check to figure out where the new top-end Steam ID is, where the numbers start going from active accounts to accounts that have not been filled in yet. But armed with this range, it's pretty trivial for a computer program to just pick out users randomly. So that's one problem solved. Now, here's the basic setup that we used to publish our initial findings for what we're calling Steam Gauge last April on Ars Technica. We had a web scraper going through those pages randomly, as I detailed. And we were getting about 80,000 to 90,000 valid players per day. Now, since then, Valve has been in touch, and we worked out some issues with them. They've been very forgiving, and long story short, now we're using the Steam API instead of scraping their public web page. This is actually a benefit to us. It's getting us more players per day than before, 170 to 210,000 coming through the API, just through a simple Amazon EC2 instance. But they asked me to ask in this presentation, if you're trying to replicate my results, please do not use a web scraper. Do not bombard Steam servers like that. They have an API public for that, so Don't be stupid like I was. Now, one problem with such a small daily sample, even at the 170,000 to 210,000 range, is that the data can be very noisy. Our estimate depends on how many owners we actually catch in the small sliver of the Steam universe that comes through. So one day I might find a lot of users who own Call of Duty Advanced Warfare, and the next day I find a little bit fewer. Obviously, Call of Duty Advanced Warfare didn't lose owners. It just looks that way because I had two different samples. Now, if I smooth out the data using a 3-day rolling sample, it looks much better. The data doesn't go up and down nearly as much. The problem with this is that it's slower to react to new sales. It takes 3 days for them to fully register into the sample, so it might be a little bit behind reality compared to the 1-day sample. But the reduction in noise, I think, makes it worth it. So here's a little bit of an example of the math that I'm using just to go over what I've been saying. Maybe in a sample I'd find 7,758 PlanetSide 2 owners in an average 3-day sample. If there were 516,215 players in that sample, I would divide it out. Approximately 1.5% of Steam users own PlanetSide 2. That's actually accurate as far as I know. You multiply that out by the size of the Steam player base, and you get a sales estimate for PlanetSide 2. Now, what is the size of the Steam player base? Was anyone paying attention earlier? Yes, you might think so. But there's a discrepancy here. Steam says there are 125 million active Steam accounts. But the range of active Steam IDs that I was talking about earlier, there are about 221 million Steam accounts. This is a pretty big discrepancy. It's probably explained by the word active under that headline. But it brings up the question, which number should be the denominator? I would be off by a factor of 2 if I picked the wrong one. So what I had to do is get to some reality testing, and I found that the bigger universe of 221 million Steam accounts from active Steam IDs was actually more accurate. Now, what do I mean by reality testing? Well, publishers aren't supposed to share the Steam stats themselves. Valve doesn't want them to for some reason, and most people stick to that. But sometimes, intentionally or not, they do reveal their numbers. For instance, March 28th, 2014, Dean Hall revealed that 1.7 million people had bought DayZ, and all of them happened to be on Steam. That's where he was selling the standalone version. Steam Gauge, at that point, had estimated 1.76 million copies sold, which I was pretty happy with. I thought it showed that my method was pretty sound. Another example, on February 20th, 2014, Gary Newman tweeted that just over 1 million people had bought Rust on Steam. Steam Gauge was saying about 930,000 at that point, so about a 7% difference. Not as good, but it was a newish game at the time, still selling, so my 3-day sample, again, was a little behind the times. Over the next 2 days, it caught up very quickly. In fact, 2 days later, I was showing almost exactly 1 million. So with those kind of reality checks, I was pretty confident that my numbers had at least some bearing on reality. I've also had some developers share their data privately, off the record, and what I found is that on the outside, it's about a plus or minus 10% difference between my estimates and the real sales reported by Steam. So if I give an estimate of 2 million, that means the real number is going to fall somewhere between 1.8 million and 2.2 million. The error is sometimes much less than this, but I've yet to find an example where it's actually off by more than 10%. Now, if you're a developer and you want to share your numbers with me off the record and see what I have to report for you, I would very much welcome that. I'm always looking to calibrate my data and figure out if something is going wrong. 10% sounds like a pretty high error, especially when nationwide polls of a few thousand people report plus or minus 3% error. But it's the best we can do for the moment, at least unless I get those Google-sized warehouses of servers. And it's fine for most relative comparisons. If one game is showing 2 million copies and another game is showing 500,000 copies on my estimate, even with the error bars, you can be sure that the first one is selling quite a bit better than the second one. Anyway, it's better than the total shot in the dark we had in the past, even if they're a little off. And it's important to remember, though, that everything here is just an informed estimate. These are not actual numbers coming from the developers or coming from Valve or coming from Steam. These are just my best guesses based on the methods I've laid out. I think they're pretty good, but they might not be exact. Another limitation of this, the sampling isn't truly random. About 8% of Steam users set their profiles to private, meaning the API and the web scraper can't actually sample them. So if you don't want to be caught up in this, if you don't want me to know what you own, go into your settings and go click the little private button, and then you're safe. Luckily for me, Steam doesn't default people to this. Everyone defaults to public, and therefore 92% of Steam users are actually out there. But it could be that the 8% that decide to be private could be very different from the public. Maybe all of them never play Dota 2. Maybe all of them play really obscure titles like Bejeweled all the time, and Bejeweled should actually be way higher on my rankings. I think this is a small enough number not to skew the results too much, but if something is off, it could be because of that 8% slice that's actually private. Another limitation of my numbers, you can't tell when the game was actually bought or played before the sampling started. All I have is the total number of owners and players from before that start in about April of 2014. That makes it hard to measure the effect of things like pricing. I don't know if a game was bought when it was 99 cents, at 90% off, or when it was at $10. Where do those sales come from? Now, after April 2014, I have a little bit of leeway to try and figure that out, and I'll go into that a little bit more later. It's also important to note that Steam is not the entire PC market, even though it feels like it sometimes. Things like Battle.net, Origin, Desura, GOG.com, Gamersgate, Uplay, itch.io, even a disc that you buy in a store, if any of you remember that. None of these things are captured by looking at Steam data, obviously. The best estimates I've seen is that Steam is about 70 to 75% of the market, so that's a pretty good chunk. That gives you a pretty good size of what people are playing on PC. But sometimes it can lead to numbers that are just downright misleading. For instance, this is a headline, Sims 3 sells 1.4 million copies in its first week, pretty good. That was years ago, and now currently my Steam Gauge estimate says 600,000 copies for The Sims 3. You probably figured out why the discrepancy. Most of The Sims 3 sales are coming from Origin or people buying it on disc. But if you were looking at my numbers, 600,000, that's actually worse than useless. It's totally undercounting things, and it's worth keeping in mind that games that are on Steam might also be sold other places. We're also missing a couple of really big games this time around. The first time I shared my data on this on ours, when I was doing web scraping, Dota 2 and Team Fortress 2 were by far the most popular games, dominating with about 47 million players combined as of March 2014. For some reason, Valve's two biggest free-to-play titles simply don't appear when I sample through the API. Even if it's a person I know owns and plays these games, they just don't come through. I'm not sure if this is a problem on my end or Valve's end. I haven't worked it out yet. But suffice to say, the data in this presentation is missing the two biggest games on Steam. They would pretty much be at the top of every list and would skew things more towards the top end. So please just keep that in mind as I go through the numbers. All right, that's the methods down. I hope it was clear enough. Now let's look at the numbers. What does this tell us about the shape of the Steam market? For one, the bulk of the Steam library is part of a long tail that represents relatively few sales for Steam's bottom line. So this graph shows all 4,400 or so Steam games tracked by our system. The data is about a week old at this point, but it's pretty close. The top sellers way over on the left with over 10 million copies, and the bottom sellers on the right under 1,000 copies. Now, when I say copies sold, I really mean copies registered to Steam accounts. This includes games registered through Humble Bundles, key giveaways, deep sales. Free-to-play games have to be clicked on and downloaded to register. So sales doesn't necessarily mean sales. It means how many registered users are on Steam with that game in their library. This makes it hard to measure revenue, again, because prices change. Some games here are free, where some games are $60, so comparing apples to oranges is a little bit there. It's also important to note, if you didn't notice, that this is a logarithmic scale, meaning that going up from one line to another is actually 10 times as much, not a linear scale. So that straight line in the middle, where it looks like sales are decreasing quite gently, that's actually exponential dropping, going down. You can see an even quicker drop on the left side, where it looks like an exponential line on this chart means that it's dropping incredibly fast. So you can see this a little more clearly if you look at the percentiles. At the 25th percentile, there's 155,000 sales, but that's down from over 10 million sales for the top copy. Drops down to 32,000 for the median game. That means half of games that are released on Steam can't expect to sell more than 32,000 copies at this point. And at the bottom end, a full 25% of games never even reach the 5-figure mark on Steam, according to my estimates. Now, at the top left there's about 213 million sellers with over 1 million in sales. These mega sellers represent a very, very large portion of the Steam market, which you can see in a graph like this, which shows the long tail in an even more extreme way. So the y-axis shows the cumulative sales share of the top X% of games on the x-axis. So on the left side, you can see that the top 15% of Steam sellers represent 80% of the total sales on Steam. This outpaces even the familiar Pareto principle, which says that in most markets, the top 20% of items are going to represent 80% of the sales. And again, if Team Fortress 2 and Dota 2 were in here, things would be skewed even more to the left on this. On the right, you see that long tail of poor performers quickly becoming a relative non-factor in the grand scheme of things as far as the entire Steam universe is concerned. The smallest 75% of games make up only 10% of the registered users of all games on Steam. Now, Valve has made a lot of efforts to increase the size of Steam quite quickly recently. The last 16 months saw as many new games on Steam as the previous 9 years combined. The vast majority of that expansion has probably had very little effect on the bottom line. Most games, 3/4 in fact, are going to end up in that long tail that represents less than 10%. But if you're adding so many games through things like Greenlight and Early Access, you're going to get a better chance of having a few games that end up in that top 15% that really drive sales. So that's the wider market, but the one thing that I always get asked about when I talk about this is what are the most popular games on Steam? Answering that question really depends on how you want to measure popularity. The easiest way is to just look at total sales, the number of registered accounts that I find on Steam with that game. And the results, top 10 results for that are here. It's not that surprising that Valve games dominate here. They were a large part of Steam from the beginning. Many of them have been out for quite a while. Unturned was actually the biggest surprise on this list to me. It's the only 2014 release on the list. It's a game that hasn't gotten really much coverage that I've seen, but it's a free-to-play title that's had a really big impact as far as registered Steam accounts goes. But looking at this baseline number, this naive number, doesn't really tell the whole story. Because simply having a game registered to your account doesn't mean that you actually play it that often, or at all. Luckily, since 2009, Steam has been keeping track of how many hours everyone puts into all of their games, and also publicly reports that number, as I mentioned earlier. So I have the total playtime for each owned game. This means we can generate a graph like this. This shows what percentage of all those registered owners that I found have actually played a game for at least 6 minutes, which seems to be the minimum it takes to register 0.1 hours on Valve's system. Now, this list is only games released since March 2009. The 400 or 500 games released before then, maybe people played them when they came out or before tracking was going, so it could skew the numbers. The games on the left in this graph, everyone who owns them has played them. This is usually free-to-play games where you're likely to download it and play it immediately, or just really popular games where if you buy it, you're going to play it some. The games on the right, that means no one has played them at all of the people who are registered owners. These are usually new games that have barely any owners in my sample anyway, so even fewer players, down to 0 in fact. For the median game, right in the middle there, only 53% of the people who have bought it have played it. That means for most games, at least 47% of people who own it have not played it on Steam. Now, that might sound a little surprising. I know it made me question my data when I first looked at it. But when I thought about it, it wasn't really that weird. Consider for yourselves, if you're Steam players, how many games have you gotten in bundles or sales or that were just free-to-play titles that looked intriguing or, $5 impulse buys, and you download them, and then you just haven't gotten around to playing them yet? Does this describe anyone in the audience? Show of hands. Yes, almost everyone. Good. I'm not crazy. Here's another way to look at this data. It's even more extreme, by individual registered copies. This pie chart's a little out of date. It's from about a year ago, but I think things haven't changed that much. shows that more than a quarter of all game copies registered to players on Steam have never been played. They've been registered, they have been added to the account, maybe even downloaded, but have 0 hours put into them. You add in another 19% that have been played for less than an hour, you're nearing 50% of everything that's going on Steam barely being played. Now, if I was a game developer, a graph like this would frankly scare me to death. People can be buying your game, going to the trouble of registering with their account, downloading it, and then forgetting about it entirely. People are picking up these games in sales and bundles again, and never bothering to come back to them. Or if they are going to come back to them, they just haven't done it yet. Maybe things will change later, but I don't know. Instead of going back to these new games, people tend to go to a very few go-to games. You can see that 1% sliver there, people have put more than 478 hours into by registered copies. Now, these are the games that when you load up Steam, you don't know what to play. You're probably just going to go back to that comfort food game, your Team Fortress 2, Dota 2. For me, it's Hearthstone. That does not show up on this graph, luckily, but it would skew things quite a bit. I'm sure all of you have one game that you've put hundreds and hundreds of hours into to the expense of those never playeds and less than 1 hour games. It would be nice if we could all be better played and have a more well-rounded experience, but we all tend to come back to these comfort food games that are utterly dominating the space on Steam. The point of all this is registered copies can be a misleading statistic. You really need to see if your game is being played and see if it's making an impact on the larger Steam market. So here's that same top 10 chart of sales from before, but now I've separated out all those unplayed games for each title. You can see the ratio of players to non-players since March 2009 is different for everything. For a game like Unturned, about a quarter of people haven't played it. For a game like Half-Life 2 Lost Coast, which is registered to a lot of accounts through freebie programs, many people have just never played it. Then again, Half-Life 2 Lost Coast was released before March 2009. Maybe a lot of people played it back then. It's a little unfair to compare things like that, but it's the best we've got right now. So another, maybe better way to sort the database that I have is by the number of players, not by the number of owners. This makes things look a little different than they did before in the top 10. For instance, Counter-Strike Go, which was in fourth place for the ownership numbers, jumps to the top, replacing the slightly older Counter-Strike Source. But again, Counter-Strike Source might be undercounted. Maybe more of those people are actually players from before March of 2009. This listing also sees games like Civilization V, Portal, Terraria, sneaking into the top 10, well-known games, not surprising that they have a lot of players. Again, Unturned is the only 2014 release on this list, and those quarter of owners who have not played the game, perhaps they just haven't gotten around to it yet. If they bought it relatively recently, maybe they'll be playing it soon. So we don't know exactly what the effect of that is. You guys have been great suffering through all these graphs, so I thought I'd give you a little cute cat breather for a second. Get rid of all the dry data. Get a water break. Now, looking at total players might not be the best way to look at the most popular Steam games either. As we saw before in that pie chart, some games that you play for an hour, and there's some games that you play for weeks on end, 50-hour sessions, all weekend, what have you. So this chart looks at total player hours spent across Steam, multiplying out the average hours for the owners across the entire Steam universe. Here, Civilization V suddenly looks a lot more popular. Not that surprising. This is a game that people play all day and all night, and it's a game that a lot of people own. Football Manager 2014 makes an appearance on the top 10 by this metric. Don't worry, it'll show up again. And Unturned has dropped off the list at this point. It's not old enough to have racked up a lot of hours yet, since it came out just in 2014. Older releases have a little bit of an edge here, as do games that have obviously sold a lot. More owners means more total player hours. And for the most part, this looks pretty similar to the most owned list. But if you're looking at total player hours, the long tail is even more starkly shown. Now, the top bar here shows in different colors the top 13 games by total player hours. Go back to the list: Counter-Strike Go, 1,702, Counter-Strike with 1,513, et cetera, et cetera. As you can see by the size of these bars, the top 13 games match almost perfectly in terms of player hours with the other 4,391 games in Steam. I'm pausing here to let that sink in. 13 games matching up with 4,391 other games. If this doesn't show that people are going back to familiar and popular games, I don't know what does. This is 0.2% of distinct games representing 50% of the playtime measured by Steam. These are the games that are getting attention. If you're not in that top 13, you're losing literally half of the player hours that are represented in my data. Again, this would be even more extreme if we had Dota 2 and Team Fortress 2 data in there. Back in April, when I did this the first time, the top 6 games represented nearly 50%, and the remaining about 2,800 or so at that point represented the rest. So the takeaway here again, capturing sales and even capturing distinct player numbers is not the same as capturing attention. These top games are capturing tons of attention. People keep coming back to them, whereas the vast majority of Steam games really can't compete. There's even more ways to slice the data. Instead of looking at total player hours, you can look at average hours per owner. Now, this helps games that might not have sold as much, but the people who do own them are very devoted. They tend to put in a lot of hours into it. Now, for this list, I've taken out games with less than 50,000 sales to prevent a very small portion of the sample affecting things. If one person owns some really obscure game and has put 1,000 hours into it, that really doesn't represent a very good average. It's just an outlier. Here, we see Football Manager 2014 shooting way up the charts, the most devoted fans on Steam by a long shot, twice as much as Civilization V. I don't know if these players are all leaving the game on overnight to simulate entire seasons, or just, have no jobs and are literally staring at the screen for entire weeks, but it's a major outlier on the top end. Not that surprising that strategy games and multiplayer shooters are the ones that the players come back to the most reliably. These are the kind of games that are capturing online attention the best on Steam, and also a few MMOs in there, EVE Online. Now, it's hard to know with all these statistics if people are still playing these games, or if that playtime may have come overwhelmingly months or even years ago. Like I said, though, a side benefit since I've started taking this data is that I can figure out what games have been played since Steam Gauge started back in April 2014. To do that, you just compare the total hours played today, the total hours played 11 months ago, divided out by the player base, and you get a nice estimate. So here's the mean hours per owner since April of 2014. And you can see Football Manager 2014 and now 2015 are still dominating. People are playing those a lot these days. Counter-Strike is very high up there, as could be expected at this point. But you also see some recent titles that have really made an impact in the past 11 months. Games like Dark Souls 2, Pro Evolution Soccer, and Binding of Isaac Rebirth, which is very gratifying for me. Do we have any Binding of Isaac players out there? You're contributing to this graph. You can also break down the data I've got in some other interesting ways. For instance, do games with better review scores sell better? Do people think yes? Show of hands. No? Well, there's a graph up there showing yes, so it's kind of an unfair question. But the conventional wisdom is supported by the empirical evidence I have. Let's remember, not all Steam games have a Metacritic rating. This is a dot plot of the 1,600 of them that do. And I know there are problems with Metacritic and Metascores as a measure of quality, but it's the best heuristic we have, so let's just go with it. Again, this is on a logarithmic scale, so going up one line in the height means actually 10 times as many sales, not just doubling, for instance. And the data is very noisy, as you can see here. Even at one level of Metacritic rating, you can have sales down in the thousands or up in the millions. So it's not a direct correlation. But you can definitely see a trend line. That orange line there, the line of best fit, looks straight, but it's actually, again, an exponential growth. At a Metacritic rating of 70, your game can expect about 100 to 200,000 sales in the middle. while at a Metacritic ranking of 90, you can expect about 200 to 400,000 sales for the mean game, or the median game, rather. Past 90, those averages go up very quickly. As you can see, at 94 plus, almost every game that gets that Metacritic rating has at least 1 million sales. So at the very top end, where all critics agree that this is a must-play game, Steam users seem to agree and buy it in very large numbers. Again, though, it's important to point out how noisy this data is, and there are lots of outliers. Right here is Dino D-Day. Got a 53 on Metacritic, but the players didn't quite agree with that. 2.8 million sales, showing the power of dinosaurs to appeal to a wide audience, I guess. And then Out of the Park Baseball 9, way down here, got an 82 on Metacritic. People seem to like it, at least the professional critics, but not the players. Only 2,000 sales so far. Maybe that'll pick up now that I've pointed out how great it is to all of you. Maybe not. Here's another way to look at the Metacritic data, breaking the reviews down into groups of 10. So here you see a bar representing all Metacritic games that got a 90 or above on that scale. The left side of the bar is the 25th percentile of sales in that range. Right here, about 350,000. The right side of the bar, the 75th percentile, about 2 million sales. So 25% of games in the 90s can expect over 2 million sales. And the median with the number right in the middle. Oops. 1 second, let's fix this. Animations, folks. There we go. So if you do this for all the Metacritic ranges down to the 50s, you can see the relationship between ranking and sales pretty quickly. Now, there's not much difference when you're in the 50s or the 60s as far as the bulk of games getting sales, but when you jump into the 70s, you already see a significant jump from games that are really sub-70, which is considerably pretty bad games, really. And then once you get into the 80s or 90s, the vast bulk of games scored in those range are doing much better than those going down. Now, this is just a correlation. You can't really tell if the reviews are driving people to buy these games or if maybe critics and players are just recognizing quality when they see it. But the correlation definitely is there, according to my data. So now that I've got this data going quite stably, I'd like to take it in quite a few future directions. I'd like to look at the effect of Steam sales on games. The massive discounts, they're heavily promoted, obviously are driving game sales up. I'd like to see exactly how much. I hoped to have that data ready for today, but unfortunately there was a little bit of a snafu during the last Steam sale. Some of the data got lost. Have to wait for the next Steam sale to come around to report on that. I'd like to compare different genres, whether indie games are doing as well as AAA games, look at things like early access and Steam Greenlight games to see how they compare to other games. You can also look at the hourly breakdowns by player, so I could see just how much your most popular game represented of your total playtime. I'm guessing it would look pretty high based on some of those other statistics, but it's not exactly the same. And with this data, you could also see what games are purchased together. Valve already gives this data somewhat, but you could look at a much more granular level. Maybe we'd see some surprising relationships between something like Bejeweled and Call of Duty. Who knows? So I'd like to say some thank yous to the Ars Technica team, especially the tech team and the legal team that helped me work through this. Valve for being very understanding about my use of the data and not shutting me down like they could have at any point and still could. But I don't think they will. I'm working with them pretty closely, so thanks, Valve. And all the readers out there who have looked at this data, and if you want to be one of them, there's a tiny URL for all the writing I've done on Ars Technica about this. I just put up a story that looked at the top sellers and performers of 2014. It's on that link. It's got a lot more data than I showed today, but didn't really have time to squeeze it all in. Here's my contact info if you have anything you want to reach out about, but for now I'll take some questions if you want to walk up to the mics. And thanks.
Hey there. So I just had a quick question about the 8% of the private accounts.
Sure.
So again, I don't know. I'm only going off of anecdotal evidence here. But in my experience, the vast majority, I'm a big Counter-Strike player.
Okay.
And I mean, in my experience, the vast majority of people that I've met, when playing online that have private accounts are almost entirely either for the purposes of hacking or of smurfing. So in other words, it's a secondary account that they use to, just to play that game at a lower ranking.
I see.
So it might. So would you think that it would make sense to maybe try to survey like more of the competitive groups and see if when do they typically do private accounts or that type of thing?
Right. So the question, if you didn't hear, is about private accounts. He thinks anecdotally many of them are for secondary accounts for people who are hacking or smurfing others. So I think if that's true, that most of those private accounts you'd want to leave out of your sample. Is that correct?
Yeah, I would think so. I mean,
so they already are being left out.
Okay.
Luckily, I hope what you're saying is true. If you could conduct a survey or figure out a way to really figure out in a reliable way how many private people are actually using just secondary accounts and trying to hide themselves for that reason, yeah, that would be very useful.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Hi.
Hi. Thanks for sharing all this data. It's great.
Yeah, no problem.
I was wondering if you've looked at any sort of forecasting based on kind of initial week or month sales, since almost every game I've seen from Steam charts kind of has this initial curve, with the exception of things like sales. So I'm wondering if you've done anything where you can actually look, after a month of data and then look 3 months later, since you're doing rolling windows, kind of how accurate that could be.
Yes, the question is about predicting sales, not before release, but I guess after a month of sales, if you could figure out where it's going to end up. Yeah, that's something we could definitely do now that we have 11 months worth of back data. And that's a really good direction that I hadn't really considered before. But yeah, I'd love to do that. So thank you for the idea. Hi.
I wanted to kind of play off of the Smurfs alternate accounts idea.
Okay.
Have you looked to see how many of your accounts just play 1 or 2 games potentially, and think that maybe they're actually 2 people represented as a single entity, or how would that impact your data?
Yeah, so the question is about smurfing. If a lot of accounts just play 1 or 2 games, that might be an indication of that. It's a decent point, but there also might just be people who've signed up for Steam because they only want to play that 1 game. I haven't done a comprehensive look at this. I'd like to, but there are a lot of people who only play 1 or 2 games. If there were a good way to separate out those people who just like 1 or 2 games from those people who are just playing a secondary account on 1 or 2 games, I don't know it. If you have any ideas, please let me know. Hello.
I have a question. Hi. I have a question. If you try to use data from groups of users, that you can make the better sample of data you are grab from.
So the question is the question is looking at groups of users. What do you mean by groups? Like Steam groups?
Yeah, like Steam groups. If you have players from some country. They
kind
are
of thing.
Merged to one group.
Right. So I don't actually have too much data on what these individual players I'm looking at are like. People can fill in their location, but relatively few do. I don't have anything like demographic data for how old these people are or races. I don't have anything except when they join Steam is the most reliable thing that I know about them demographically. I would love to have that data, but Valve doesn't collect it and people don't really volunteer it. I could look at the very small subsample of people that do put in their location, but that's a self-selected sample. I don't think it would be very reliable. Yes, thanks.
I wanted to say thanks for sharing this information. It's really exciting. I know it's a lot of work. And
yes, thank you.
Pretty darn accurate. Even the NPD data is, back in the day, was like pretty varied. Like for example, Nintendo sales were a little underreported when overreported because of extrapolation. Because retailers had that moved a lot of Nintendo units, like reported very heavily, but early on, like NPD data that moved a lot of PlayStation units underreported because
I know Walmart was not part of NPD data, and they try to predict it. So yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So there's a compensation, but I would say 8% is really close, and it's really helpful for us and very valuable. So thanks for the work you shared.
Oh, no problem. And if you go to the link up there, I have lists for the top 1,000 games from last April and the top 400 games. I give some raw numbers that you can play with yourself. So not giving away everything, but enough data that I really think you can dig deep into it. So yeah, please feel free.
Thanks.
Anyone else before we want to get out of here and get some dinner? All right, you have my contact information. If you want to come up privately afterwards, they're going to kick us out in about 15 minutes, but we could go to the overflow room. And thanks again for coming. Hope you enjoyed it.